started here. Hope you're a little patient with me. I haven't ever presented before, but I am Brendan Martin. I work full-time at the Peninsula School District, and I've also been working a few years for a LLC that supports ACPE. You might have seen me around the past few years and downstairs at the Makerspace. We're going to talk about Docker and specifically how you can use Docker to make life easy for your users. My email's down here, and then you can find me on GitHub. This isn't connected to my laptop, but so we're going to talk about, what is Docker? Why should you use containers? What is CAS? What is Shibboleth? And how can we fit it all together to create a very seamless experience for our students? So I think I'll start by kind of showing what the Peninsula School District's login system looks like. So if I go to my portal, so this is the customized CAS interface that that we're using. It gets 300,000 hits a month, pretty quick. Normally CAS doesn't even look like this, and I'll kind of go through and look at some of the configs that make it work and make it pretty. They've done things like adding a little version icon there and even Easter egg. Kids really like that. Analytics is tied to that, thousands a day actually, which is, we're here for the students. Once I log in, I get directed to my portal, and this is a Ember app that is all hosted through S3. There's no backend for this app. Very, very stable. It has frequently used links at the top. I can go up here, change my password with a custom tool we made, even set student passwords if I'm a staff member. But what we're here to focus on is SAML. So now that I've authenticated with CAS, I have a cookie on both the client and the CAS server. So if I click on Schoology, it goes to IDP, which is CAS or Shibboleth, and then CAS will respond without any intervention, and I'm logged in to whatever service I am trying to get to. Google is, you don't even need Shibboleth for that. That can be just CAS, but like I can just instantly go to my Google Drive. Already logged in. Another one we've done is let's see, had a homeroom. So our LMS goes through IDP, gets sent off, and then once this Wi-Fi loads, I'll be in a homeroom. Very seamless experience for the end user. Let me go back to this. All right. So now that you've kind of seen the end goal. So Docker. Anyone here heard of Docker? It's kind of, from my perspective, it's the next step in server-based computing. Traditionally, we have a host OS, a hypervisor layer, and then, many VMs that have, overhead. They have a guest OS, and then they have the libraries you need, and then your application that runs on top. Now, with Docker, it's a whole new paradigm shift. All my Docker hosts are actually VMs, so they sit inside this VM, but then from that VM, I could then run many different applications that share common resources And it just makes life a lot easier because I don't need to worry about this VM and all of its overhead, and then if I need to do an OS upgrade, it's just a lot simpler. And with this one VM, I now can have I have a Docker server that has 20 plus containers, and it's still less than 10% CPU most of the time. So it's very efficient, and I can move containers around very easily. And in the new Docker versions, they even have mesh networking and auto load balancing for containers. So if you have multiple Docker VMs, you can have automatic failover with very, very sophisticated automatic transfer of containers that's seamless for the end user. And it's also widely supported now. Even on Windows, it'll run in the HyperV interface for Windows, and you can run a very small version of Windows and have specific tasks for that. Like you can have a domain controller, or you can have a DHCP server that's 500 megabytes in size running inside of a container. Docker is composed of these Docker files. Docker files are plain text. You can open them in any text editor, store them on any sort of file system that you'd want. Most of them are on GitHub, and they look just like this. So this is from Nginx. This Docker file has millions and millions of users that use it daily, and as you can see, it's essentially what you would run if you were, what you would see if you were just to open a VM and start typing the commands you need for configuration. It pulled from a base image, so like this is Ubuntu, probably the latest version, and then it has run commands. These are all just ran sequentially. This would essentially what you need to set up your application. And then there's commands for different ways to make the container work, as in volumes. So these are essentially mount points from your host to your container. Containers are completely ephemeral, so you don't care if the container goes away. Your data is stored elsewhere. Your data is either stored on the host or a network share or somewhere safe where you won't lose your data. But you can delete your container, you can throw it away, your server can blow up, and you don't care because your data is somewhere else. Which is very nice, especially if you have any sort of file corruption, or you need to do upgrades of your application. Your data is completely separate. This is, workdir is just, essentially CD to this directory, and that's where you're based out of. Command is just what the container does after it starts up. So in this Docker file, it would run Nginx, and that's what you would see on your std out. And then ports to expose, you can expose none and just have a running application, or you can, if you have a web app, you can have any type of port exposed that you wish. And these are readily available. These images are on the Docker Hub, and there's so many. You can just search and go on forever of all the different applications that you can simply deploy with a single command. Lots of different things. Go back. Let's close that tab. Too many tabs. All right. Docker Compose was started outside of the Docker organization, but now it's kind of bundled in. I use it religiously because normally you would have to remember, all the instruction that would take to set up the container. So you'd have the image and the parameters it would take. But with a Docker Compose file, it's just a YAML configuration that you run one simple command inside the directory you're in, and it runs your container based on the parameters you give it. So the image would be like your Nginx image, or an image that you can build on the host, and then Docker compose up it's running. It's really great for documentation, as in I don't have to remember where that directory is now. I have my volume that's obviously stored there that's mapped to this folder inside my container. These can be like read-write, they can be read-only, and this will persist. So whatever is in this directory when this container starts is now in this directory. So this is where you'd put your configuration, your database, your whatever your application needs that is specific to it.
Does that volume sit on the host OS though? It's not in the container, right?
Right. So it sits on the host OS, like in this folder, and then the colon says, put it into this directory inside the container. Okay. And so whatever the container does to this directory happens over here immediately.
But that doesn't have to be on the host. It can be anywhere.
It can be anywhere. They even have new volume drivers, so you can have S3, you can have a SMB share, you can have any sort of, you can create a volume driver if you really wish. There's many, many different options for where your data is stored. This is the basic example of I have my host that's running Docker, and then I'm mapping this folder to it. You can even map individual files, but I don't know why you would. Maybe you would. But. So why not a VM? Why add this abstraction layer? Well, because people make mistakes. I make a lot of mistakes, and if I make a mistake inside of a container, it doesn't matter. I can delete the container and rebuild it in a matter of seconds. If I make a mistake on a VM, I better hope that I had a snapshot. What's your failover for a VM? Many different ways, but it's a lot faster to just have a text file and run one command to get it back up. Storing it anywhere is amazing for documentation, and the ability to just put this text file on the internet for anyone to find and use is an amazing feature of open source. One command, that's just, it's probably the greatest thing, because it's also resilient to environmental change. I can take a container that has a base image of Ubuntu and run it on CentOS, or run it on Windows, or run it on a Mac. It doesn't matter where it's running. The container has an image that's pre-built, and it runs code. It just works. It's also more secure, because if an attacker attacks my container, where can you go? You can go nowhere. You can go to the container, its resources. The networking that goes into Docker is they use a mesh network that is essentially, if you do like an ifconfig, it will show your different Docker network mount points, like it will show the IP address of the container, which you can actually get to from the host, but you can't get to from another computer unless you route your IP tables correctly. So this container is not accessible unless you expose the port, and then it's only accessible via that port. It's a lot easier to restrain and keep private. They're also easy to upgrade. All you do is change your Docker file, build your image, compose up, and voila, your application is now updated. Maybe you do that in a development instance, and then migrate that over to your production server, where you would just change your load balancer to point the new place. I usually use random ports like 5565, and then my load balancer takes port 80443 to my application running inside of that Docker host. So what I want to focus on, though, is authentication. I could talk about Docker all day, but we need to have an application to run in it. So what I showed you earlier was CAS, and that's what you saw, but what was underneath the hood on some of those services is Shibboleth. Both of these now have supported Docker files from their respective developers. when I first got started in this, it was kind of up in the air. People had made Docker files, and they were mostly hacked together and worked only for them, so I had to change a lot of things. Now you have, on the hub, you get, this, pre-built image that supports the things that you'd want. You can even look, it doesn't show the Docker file here, but I think that you could see it on GitHub. I think this resolution is too small. No? Not sure where the Docker file is. Here it is, maybe? Yeah. So here's the entire source code of this CAS Docker file, and there's the Docker file. You can see all the things it does. If it doesn't work out of the box, you just clone this to your machine and then change what you need. So sometimes you'll need to change the certificates, and any sort of config file that you would need, you'd have to change on the host and then map those into your container. Same thing with Shibboleth. They have a Docker file here. This was also non-existent when I initially began. So this directory is where I'll go through and look at some of these files, but this is where most of the magic happens. And then credentials, you'll need these certificates for signing your SAML, which is very nice that they lay all this out. And then there's the Docker file. Simple text. Imagine trying to do this on a VM. Can you remember all of these commands and then run them sequentially? That would be very difficult, and I don't even want to think about that. Oh, I think I skipped a page. Nope. All right. So CAS is highly configurable. As you saw, mine it had an Easter egg. It had, animations, and it had, effects that make it custom to my organization. One of the great things of open source. It has an open API, and so a lot of services like WordPress or Drupal or Moodle and all these different services have plugins that then you can link to your CAS server. Mostly it's give it the URL, give it the port. Maybe if you have a /URL, enter that too, and then credentials to authenticate through the API. Very simple to set up once you have CAS running. And it has that supported Docker image again. This is our customized version of the overlay. So the overlay is essentially all your UI elements and your base configuration. So we just uploaded it to GitHub because why not? Someone else may find it useful. So the pom.xml through CAS is essentially where you would add your dependencies, and this is where, so if you want to have Google go through CAS, you don't even need Shibboleth for that. There's a dependency plugin that you can just paste into here, point Google there, it works. And this is also where you configure LDAP. So you want to authenticate via your Windows Active Directory, you need to import this LDAP dependency. And then in the properties, this is a simple properties file. It basically adds environmental variables to the entire CAS application. You'd say like, oh, here's my LDAP server and the domain that you need, and here's how you authenticate the base DN for all of our users. We don't use the manager actually, so that's just example that you could. And then search filter, so this is like what the user is expected, so you type your username in and then that's how it links to that. And then you also have to add like, this is our domain because user at whatever your domain is.
Can you do subdomain authentication?
I believe so.
Okay. I couldn't figure out how to do it, that's why I was asking.
I'm sure Google knows. I'm not sure off the top of my head. And this is I have a link to the overlay. All these subfolders that go into CAS, and then here's your default UI. Was able to customize that very simply. And then let me just look at that real quick. HTML essentially, it's JSP, Java, server-side rendering. It has directives for importing other files, and we added these icons for getting to resources specific to us. You can customize like error messages, and I added CSS for different elements. Yeah, pretty straightforward once you kind of dig in there. Then there's the property file configurator. This is essentially where you would say, oh, here's the location to my CAS properties. You probably have to change some of these beans depending on where your CAS is looking. Very quick. So once you have CAS going and you have it authenticating with LDAP, you will probably need Shibboleth to do some more of broad vendor support. So the flow is immensely complicated. It is such a pain, to be honest. It uses XML as the primary configuration source, which, shoot me now. But the flow it goes back and forth between the user, the service provider. This would be Google or Schoology or whoever is providing the service for the user. The identity provider is you. You're providing the identity to your service. So, generate SAML request, goes back to the browser, parses here, sends it back, and then you're logged in. The user doesn't see any of this. It's just changing the URL up here a few times. And there's lots of testing involved with this, obviously. So when I'm setting up a vendor, it normally takes maybe a week or maybe a month, depending on the vendor, of course. Some of them, they have nice interfaces. So you can just import the metadata you need, grab their metadata with a URL, and pretty quick. Most of the time, though, the service provider has very specific needs, and you'll run into problems. But it's usually they usually have someone staffed to support that. There's that. We already looked at the Docker image. So in Shibboleth, there's quite a few things. There's quite a large overhead to get started, but it has the same type of properties file as CAS, where you would say, there's many different options here, but this is what we use to get CAS going. Do you need the entity ID? This is what is signed in your SAML responses and requests. So this is basically saying use CAS as the front end. Like how is this user going? How am I going to get the username? We're getting it from CAS, from this URL, and then I have a login URL that's my they're using the environmental variable here at /login. That sometimes is different depending on your CAS install. And then so this is my server names. This would be pretty much match up here, but it's mostly to talk to CAS. That's really all you need in the properties to get CAS going. And then there's also, of course, an XML file for CAS that essentially imports the CAS bean, and this would be where your CAS instance is located. And then there's also, you have to go into Auth General and tell it, hey, look, I'm also a bean here that this is what you're going to use for the available authentication flows. So you need to say many different areas. This is what we're doing. We're going to go through CAS. Because there's many different ways you can use Shibboleth. You can use it as you can have just a username and password field there, where then it would just go through and look at these 3 files. These are the most important, and once you kind of get CAS talking with Shibboleth, this is where you would then configure all of your providers. So let's take a look at that. The relying party is what you would use essentially to get started. So a lot of this up here is boilerplate, and then there's some example right here. This is how you add a service provider. So the relying IDs, some of them are URLs, as in the metadata that comes from the service provider is grabbed automatically from their web presence. So they would give you a URL, and they can update this at any time. It's great because, then they can update their certificates every few months, or if they need to change TLS versions, they can do that without having to exchange metadata again. And this part is very trial and error for some providers. Some of them haven't ever worked with Shibboleth before, but most have. And these are always sort of up in the air for them. They essentially, you're telling it how to sign and encrypt the SAML responses. And and they're all different. So we have 7 or 8 different services, and some of them, we are signing, and we are sending responses. It's kind of scary when they're not, but realistically, it would be very difficult to intercept that huge SAML flow. But security is always a concern. These with just the IDs of a URN, those would be services that give you a metadata XML file that then you put into a metadata folder. And this URN is how Shibboleth attaches the metadata to a service. And you would use the URL in a few different areas as well. We'll look at that right now. So the resolver is, where am I getting the data from? Each service provider will want a username or a password or something very specific to them, how they link the identity of a user to their own service. Some of them want, am I a teacher? Am I a student? Am I, what grade am I in? Some of them are very, very specific in what they want. So what you'll do is you'll need a resolver. And here is where you'd also configure Shibboleth to point to LDAP. So essentially, all you get from CAS is a username. Once you authenticate with CAS, you get a username, and then Shibboleth has to take that username and look it up. They need to get data from it. So here you would add a data connector, as in you're pointing it to your LDAP URL, and you're giving it how you authenticate, and your principal names, and the password. So this would be like your admin user that can search all the users and grab a user's properties. So yes, same account name. This is like how you filter, and this is the attributes that you want to grab. So every time it looks up a user in LDAP, these are the attributes that it would then find and return. So what you do with that is you have attribute definitions. So the ID would be linked later on, and this is the attribute that you need. It then would go through and then encode whatever that attribute is that you're trying to get. And so if my service needs the username, I would return this login ID. You can also do, this is a script. So some of them, they want, PSD. They want like a certain identifier, for their login name. That in their system, they've imported the usernames as PSD_Martin B. And so here, it's going through and it's grabbing the user ID, and then this is JavaScript to then return a very specific formula for their account name. Different attributes are needed by different services, and so some of them you can share, and then some of them you have to kind of like duplicate, but for the most part, they're pretty similar. Most of them you can just pull the record from Active Directory and just pull it through like, oh, here's my email. And then there's another script down here. So this is like the user's full name. So they want one of the services needed the first name space last name. So that's how you would then use a script to create that specific attribute. Go through. There's another one that I wanted to look at. Department. This one's pretty nice. So this is one for Schoology. They wanted, what role am I? Am I a teacher or am I a student? So this is a script that looks through the employee type that we store in Active Directory and checks if they're a staff. If they are a staff, they get teacher. If they're not a staff, they get a student. So this is very, very powerful when you get into the nuts and bolts. And it highly, highly configurable. This is a timestamp. You need a timestamp for some services, as in, you don't want your request to time out for spoofing reasons. So this is where your service would get your attributes. It's resolving the attributes for those relying parties. This is where you would then link the relying parties to your attributes. So this filter goes through and it says, all right, so for this service, this would be the URL to their metadata, you want to give them the role, you want to give them the login ID, user ID, given name, and these IDs just match what's in your resolver. So, they want all these different data elements that are then sent with the SAML response. Same thing, it's just, this one's actually a test service provider that I created for testing purposes, so that I have an automated test that makes sure that my Shibboleth is actually working, and it responds with these attributes. Freshdesk is our ticketing system. It needs these specific attributes, and they have a very specific, user dot in user dot user dot. That's where you would have to create multiple resolvers that basically ask for the same data. Now for Schoology, they just want the username and email because they store everything else. Yeah. So yeah, you can go. Later on, I'll post this on the page, on the session page, and you can kind of look through this. All right. So need to add useful URLs here. That'll probably be later. But is there any questions?
Is CAS doing an LDAP lookup as well as Shibboleth?
Yes. So CAS, the API, only responds with the username. It says, like in our portal, it has to also query another database for more user data, because the CAS API just sends, here's who's logged in. This is the user's username, no other data. So yeah, CAS and Shibboleth both do an LDAP lookup for that. And so the way we have it configured is we have an Amazon EC2, a few instances running. One of them is a Docker server running CAS and Shibboleth. The other one is a Windows Active Directory domain controller that is replicated across a VPN. So CAS and Shibboleth read from that domain controller. So user passwords that are set there, and then they replicate throughout. And that way, if we have a power outage or some sort of service interruption, our important login services are still available for our users. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Just a kind of a general user question. So, like, we're all Windows shop, right? So, what's kind of the user experience for your users, like from boot up?
From boot up?
Yeah, from on their PCs, whether
Oh, it's essentially it's the same as a regular Active Directory. Our Windows computers connect to Active Directory, and they log in with the same credentials they use in our portal.
And then, are they then launching a web portal?
Right.
Like that's kind of like the first thing they do is so they log into the PC and then they log into the web portal.
Right.
And then they're kind of off and running at that point.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So there is ways that you can have Shibboleth linked with Windows, and that it would share those credentials. I haven't been able to I don't have time to figure that out, but you can also do Office 365 with SAML, and Microsoft actually has this well documented on how to do that. So yeah, there are ways, as in like the best experience with a Chromebook, we have Google using CAS, and on a Chromebook, you open the Chromebook and you have a window with our login screen, and that passes that cookie on into the browser. So when you log in, you're instantly into everything else without any other steps. It's just you're in. Saves a lot of time and a lot of frustration not having to log in twice or yeah. Ideally, that's what Windows could look like, but you know, Active Directory.
What are CAS and Shibboleth's services roles? Before I came here, I had never heard of those. So CAS, it looks like some sort of first stage login.
Right.
And Shibboleth does what, SAML or?
Yes. So Shibboleth handles all the SAML communication between your vendors. So CAS could be used without Shibboleth. You don't necessarily need it for even Google. You can use CAS just by itself. For a lot of applications have plugins for CAS, so WordPress and Moodle and Drupal, they all have these plugins that you can then just say, here's my CAS server, here's how you log in. So you don't need SAML for a lot of things, but a lot of things you do. And a lot of vendors support it now, and it's an increasingly popular thing. And Shibboleth isn't the only SAML provider. You can pay thousands of dollars a month for a, trusted SAML provider, but you're really just doing the same thing. You're exchanging metadata with your services, and you're just relying on somebody else's GUI to do it for you. Whereas this is free, you're paying for the man hours to set it up and update it, maintain it, have someone who knows it that can add metadata. But after it's set up, it just works. I haven't had any problems in the last 2 years, other than just getting vendors to kind of, talk back and forth and make sure we have the right configuration so that it works. I have, on my Docker server, I have a production IDP and a production CAS, as well as development versions that run on different ports and different URLs that don't really work with other things. And so what I do is I get it working in development, and then with my vendor. And once I have a working metadata, working attribute resolver, then I'll just use Docker to commit that image, compose up, boom, now that's sitting in production. So, yeah.
Is CAS an implementation of a specification, or does it just happen to be a front runner?
It is its own specification.
Okay.
Yeah. So it does work with some SAML, like Google. You can just plop in the dependency, point Google to it, it's up. But other than that, it's its own sort of implementation, and it does have an open API, so you can just say, like in our portal, we just grab the ticket from CAS and then ask CAS with their API who's logged in, and then it tells us who's logged in with a JSON API, and then we look up that user. So it's very, very basic implementation. Yeah.
So you showed us using Docker for SAML right now. What other services can you completely get rid of your hypervisor?
Yes, you can run any application, anything in Docker. Any new application that I set up, any web application, any VM that I would normally create is now just a Docker file that's sitting in a text file on hard disk. I have services for our radio station in Docker. I have all of our websites in Docker. I have, of course, this in Docker, as well as, so I have like WordPress. I have a custom API running in Docker. There's no limit. You can run Windows in Docker now with a 500 megabyte Windows image. Very efficient, shares resources with the host. So you can have, your domain controller with DHCP even running on the same host.
Right. So essentially, you just have one single host, or how do you
It
figure that out with load balancing?
it kind of depends. So I have about 4 Docker servers, all running Linux. I have 2 in the cloud and then 2 on site. The one primary runs most of the things. The other one is just websites. The more advanced usage of Docker is you can have a swarm. It's fairly new within the last year, but you register all of your Docker hosts as a swarm, and then you define inside of your config, like, how many instances of this web server do I want to run? And then it will automatically move the containers based on the load of the host and load balance requests. So if I have, one URL for this website, Docker will take that and be like, oh, well, this website, this host is kind of busy. Let's send it off to this one. And it will maintain those containers in a way where even if one host dies, then it's like, oh, well, we need these other services running over here too. And you get this very resilient, very, very resilient container cluster, if you will. A little more advanced, but yeah.
How does Docker handle updates? So do you like close down the thing and then bring up a new Docker or a new server with a newer version, or does it update it inside? How does that
You
happen?
can. So you can use, you would have to restart Docker in order to apply an update on the same host. But yes, you can just do apt get and upgrade Docker, and then the engine is then restarted, and your containers then just come back up.
But what I'm talking about is like, how would you update like the Shibboleth service?
Right. So that's where I would have 2 instances of the container running. So I'd have a production container that's always handling requests, and then a development container where I can experiment, get it working, and then what I would normally do is Docker is based on these images, and I would commit the development instance to an image, and then say use compose to point to that image. I usually do like latest, or maybe you do like a month versioning. So when you do compose up, it notices, oh, hey, well, this image is different. Let's spin up this new version, and it would just restart the container. And there's, in some instances where downtime is unacceptable, I'll have like a staging where I have literally a production version running alongside the other production that's already upgraded. And then my load balancer would then point to staging if it couldn't get to production. And so requests are always handled. I can then reboot each one, after another, and you're upgraded.
And then if for some reason that version you have a problem with, you just revert back to the old version.
Right. With images, you can just say, well, use the last image.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does Docker, do you have with Docker some sort of a way to watch resources? Let's say everything just starts coming to a crawl and you want to determine which container is causing the problem?
Yes. Okay. So this is actually my cloud host that is running, a staging version of CAS, my production version of CAS, my test Shibboleth, and my production Shibboleth. Commands, there is, I don't remember off the top of my head. Yeah. Oh, that's top for like a container. There's a way that you can see. Yeah. So then I can see what container is using what resources down to the 0.02%, which is really nice if we have, we have a huge WordPress instance going where we have 4 different containers: production, backup, staging, and then development. And so if production isn't available, fails over to backup. If backup isn't available, you fall over to staging, which may or may not work. Depends on how our web developer is feeling that week. And then development is where she does all of her work. And using Docker, we just have a script where she can say, all right, take backup, put it to production, or vice versa. Take staging, this is ready for deployment, send it over to production. And she can do just, file level or database too, and most of the time you don't even need to restart the container. PHP will just start using those new files. And it's ephemeral, so we have the host storing the live data using, having scripts that back it up, and then if the container blows up and goes away, who cares? Data is fine. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
What version of Docker are you guys using? Enterprise?
Oh, just the free,
Version? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, the 1.12 is kind of where they added the swarm and a lot of other new functionality that makes it extremely powerful if you get into it.
You haven't seen any setbacks though because you're using free versus any of the paid ones?
The paid, you basically get a glorified GUI.
Okay.
You get a GUI where you can click a button and then deploy an image, and you get cloud computing with it. There's not a whole lot of reason, and in fact, you can get free GUIs. I wonder if I can. I don't think DNS will work here. Let me check. But I have a GUI running on my other Docker server. I'm not entirely sure what it's even called. Let me just SSH into that. This is this Docker host is. Oh, no, that's right. I'll just use the IP because DNS. This guy is running a whole bunch. I have Puppet running on this, which manages all of my Linux servers. All of my Linux servers check into Puppet, ask, hey, what's my configuration, and apply this, make it so. And I mean, look at, there's school going on right now. These containers are being used, and there's literally no CPU being used. But I do have, I wanted to see this screen resolution. Let's see. I don't even see it.
How are you liking Pydio?
Pydio is, it's pretty good. Yeah, I have it running in Docker.
Well, that's why I'm asking.
It's pretty intuitive, and it works with CAS too. So if I'm in my portal, I had it in here somewhere. I just go to my files, and then I can see my S drive as it shows up on Windows. As we just have a network share that I have mounted inside of that container that then maps your username to your folder, and you get what you get. It's nice. I wish we had the funds to pay for it because it'd be a great substitute for Google Drive for shared folders or very sensitive information that for bureaucratic reasons can't be stored on the cloud. They have to be stored on our server here, and yeah, they gotta do that. And I just recently upgraded this, and then it took less than an hour. I was running it on an old Apache server that was a standalone VM, and it was pretty out of date. But with Docker, it was like, here's the image, here's the folders, set up CAS, go. Very, very quick and easy. And I don't think I have any. Since I'm an admin, it looks different for me. There it is. Normally, when people log in, they just get sent right here. So here's all my my files. And the problem with this is like, so if I have a text file, you can't really edit it in here. You have to download it, make your changes, re-upload. That's sort of the limitation with PyDO.
Well, what's funny is that I have a specific use case that requires that.
Ah.
I'm trying to migrate off of an old system, so that might be, you know what I'm thinking about. Yeah. Now, so I know it's off topic from your discussion. PyDO versus HomeCloud. Compare the two? Or?
I have never used HomeCloud, but I've heard of it. And it seems like it might be a better option. I don't know.
They both do similar things. HomeCloud or PyDO.
HomeCloud seems to have more of what I would want, where you can edit files there. I mean, you can do that in PyDO, but you have to pay. You have to pay for it and get the right plugin. But
no, that's what I'm thinking. Like, that might be perfect.
Yeah, even just to try it out. I mean, there's Docker. You can run it on your Mac and get it going on a Mac or a PC. Take your configuration and then plop it on a server, production ready. Yeah, I mean that's a great thing because I can just go on my MacBook. I don't think I have Docker here. Yeah, I don't. But I can go on my my workstation. I think I had Docker here. No, it's not running. But they have like a .app where you just run it, and as long as your processor supports HyperV, it's essentially the same as running Docker on a Linux server. You same exact environment where if it works on your Mac, it'll work on your server. It'll work anywhere else Docker works. So that's where I developed most of CAS was, especially the interface, getting that running on my Mac, my workstation, and then taking that configuration that works, putting it on the server behind the load balancer, and good to go.
And you just move your data part up.
Right, and for that I just commit it to GitHub, pull it down, copy the certificates I need that are private, and then good to go. Yeah, I even have some Phantom.js scripts running on here, which that's like for web automation, so I can go and that's doing a tests for Shibboleth. That it's an automatic. We use Nagios for monitoring, and so if my Shibboleth isn't working, I get an email saying that my test user couldn't log in. So it's never happened though, but if it did. And this is where I host like Samba shares from here too. So I would mount the shares that I want accessible into my container, and then you just connect the server with SMB.
Now, what's recommended? Do you point for the data portions of the Docker stuff? Do you usually point to the local server, or do you point to like a central file server?
Yeah, most of the time for speed purposes and just ease of use, I'll just make it on the host. For the most part, I'm not too concerned about that, as I normally make file level backups, and we have VM backups with Veeam, and I'm not really worried about losing my server because we do have backups. But I have experimented with Amazon EFS. So our Internet Academy is running in Moodle in a Docker container on the cloud, and the data for that is enormous. Like, kids upload 1 gigabyte movie files all the time, and so we have 30 gigabytes of Moodle data that is mounted directly from Amazon EFS, which is a virtually unlimited file storage. You get up to 6 terabytes or 6 petabytes, some huge number that we'll never ever use, but we just pay for the gigabytes we use, and it's like 3 cents a gigabyte per month. So it's really not even that expensive. And then it's ephemeral container. I can delete the container. All that configuration is in my compose file. So I use a volume driver for compose or for Docker that just says, oh, well, here's your EFS volume. Go ham. Here's how you mount it, and then Moodle sees it as if it were sitting on the local disk. Yeah. Yeah.
Does CAS have any facilities for, as an admin, logging in as another user so you can see what they're seeing in the case of some sort of issue?
I think that you could. I never really had the need to do that. I have like test accounts that have the same permissions and same rights as a student or teacher would. So for the most part, I'll just use one of those. And I mean, for most services, if there is a problem, it's mostly due to that service having a problem, or it can't find their user. Their user has some malformed data. So for the most part, it's not necessarily needed. So yeah, I think there is some way you can do that though. Yeah, anything else?
For someone that's never used Docker and wants to perhaps maybe learn more about it, is there specific URLs or any specific area that you would recommend the community?
Oh yeah.
Say, hey, you could probably get started here, or check this out.
Docker has great documentation on their website. Yeah, docs.docker.com. And this it even has like more advanced stuff like swarms and stacks and just sort of the basics, how the containers operate, and you can learn a lot from here. So, yeah, and I recommend just setting up on your workstation. Just install on your workstation, see what happens, see if you can get something to work, and then go from there. Put it on a server, or I have it running on a Raspberry Pi. You can run this on your Raspberry Pi even.
As far as the host operating system, is there any specific that everybody kind of likes to use?
Nope.
No?
Nope, not at all. I have. I usually like to have a Docker host for each OS. So some images are based on Ubuntu or based on CentOS, and it doesn't even matter. You could run a CentOS Docker image on a Ubuntu host or a Mac host or a Windows host. It doesn't even matter because all those files are contained within the image. But for efficiency, since it shares libraries and binaries with the host, you might as well have a Ubuntu host and a CentOS host and a Windows host and whatever container that it's pulling from. It would share those libraries. And even to the point of you had a CentOS host and 3 Ubuntu containers, those will still share. Those 3 containers will still share, but you're just adding a little bit, 500 megabytes of overhead, eating up some RAM. But for the most part, it'll work.
And you're running all those hosts in that example as VM, yes.
Right. So like we have ESX infrastructure in the back where it runs, vSphere, and we have many different Windows servers. None of them are containerized yet. That's not my job. But the Linux servers, it's just, this is a VM here that is running all these containers. This VM could go away, and as long as I have a backup of the Docker files, it's all good. I've actually lost this before. I didn't have a backup, and it sucked, but it only took like a week to get everything back. Yeah. I really wanted to find that I had a Docker interface running, but I think that was before I lost everything. So yeah, I do have a Puppet database, or Puppet. I have 2 Puppet interfaces going, which is pretty nice. And since Puppet's running on this, it's the containers. And I'll look at that. It's a pretty nice. So here's the compose file for my Puppet. This is pretty sophisticated. So it creates a network so that they all share this. They have an isolated network, these containers. And when I'm defining the service of Puppet, it has a network of Puppet, and then it can only see what's inside that network, and if I expose anything outside of that, and then so I can add hosts saying like, here's your database, here's your Puppet database, and this is where you would go. This is essentially like adding etc hosts. This is mapping this DNS to that IP, which is that IP from the Puppet database here. Now, right now, that I actually have a problem with that because this is a static. I could actually use Puppet to change that, but then you're getting into like what came first, chicken or the egg. And then you can even so you define environmental variables with compose that I could change these on the fly. If I need to change my database password, I can just change, and then compose upd would recreate it. Yeah, and then these interfaces, these two interfaces, just link to the database of Puppet, and when you visit them, it shows you what they see. So.
But that was multiple containers on one Docker file?
Yeah, that's the beauty of Compose, is that you can have many, many containers in this one file that are interlinked together in a very specific way, where they just kind of work. And you can have Docker files referencing other Docker files, or Compose files referencing other Compose files or other containers that are already running, but having them all into one bundle is glorious.
Dependencies, like you're talking, like you want DNS before you reference things by name.
Right.
So it does handle dependencies.
Yeah, so these, yeah, so if I do a link, it'll make sure that these are up first before it actually runs this. So this will not start until these are up. And if you can have actually a loop there where it won't even start, because if I made Puppet depend on Puppet board, it would be like, whoa, I don't know what to do, because you're saying that, you have a dependency loop, essentially. So that's oh, that one's broken.
Do you have one Puppet instance for all of your Linux stuff, or do you have a separate one for your Raspberry Pis and your monitoring?
I have just one.
Okay.
Yeah. So, oh, come on, screen.
Yeah, screen resolution.
Yeah. So, obviously some of these haven't reported in a little while. These might actually be bad entries because of the way that it handles. But I could then see my nodes, and unchanged is good. There's my pies, and I can click on a pie, and then I can see all these facts. Puppet's based on facts, so I have what packages are installed, and what's my IP address and MAC addresses, and so many facts, like data overload. And all my servers, and you can even go into reports. There's a way you can get to what had changed, and obviously this hadn't changed, but it would show you here if there was something that actually was different for this. Like that one failed. This is actually a Mac, because Macs can check into Puppet too. But like here, it would say, oh well, there's an error because this isn't a thing, and this is what had changed. So yeah, they're all running from the same host, and that host actually checks into itself and grabs configuration from the container running inside of it.
Puppet managing Puppet.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, I do have I have Docker running on all my Pis, and that's right now the ones that are out the building. They're not doing anything, but I do have one on the bench that's running NetBoot server for Macs. So I have a Raspberry Pi that's running this application that responds to DHCP requests for Macs and tells them where they can boot. Why not?
Who's gonna stop?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Include that keyboard on your workstation, Robin.
What?
That keyboard? No, the keyboard I borrowed last night.
Oh.
I put it down there somewhere.
Thanks.